The church echoed with cruel, biting laughter as the groom abandoned his plus-sized bride at the altar, loudly mocking her weight for the entire town to hear. But the mockery died instantly when the heavy oak doors shattered open, and Wyoming's most feared mountain man stepped forward to claim her. The wind howling off the Wyoming plains on the 12th of October, 1878, carried a bitter chill, but inside the First Methodist Church of Bitter Creek, the air was stifling. Sophia Higgins stood in the vestibule, clutching a bouquet of fading prairie asters. At 22, Sophia was not built like the fragile, wasp-waisted women featured in the Godey's Ladies book that the local girls fawned over. She was a woman of substance, thick-waisted, broad-shouldered, with soft, generous curves that came from a life of hard work, hauling heavy sacks of flour and sugar in her late father's mercantile. For years, the townsfolk had spoken of Sophia in patronizing whispers. Such a sweet girl, but what a pity about her size. Who will ever take her on? Yet today, she was a bride. Her dress, made of heavy ivory satin, felt like a suffocating armor. She had spent weeks sewing it, desperately trying to add extra lace to conceal her arms and the fullness of her figure, hoping to look small and delicate. She wanted to look beautiful for Jebediah Ruskin. Jeb was the town's golden boy, tall, lean, with a smile that could charm a snake out of its hole. He had begun courting Sophia just 3 weeks after her father, Thomas Higgins, passed away from consumption. Thomas had left Sophia the deed to the Higgins General Store, the most profitable business within a 100-mile radius. Sophia, blinded by grief and the sudden, intoxicating attention of a handsome man, chose to ignore the warning signs, how Jeb's eyes always wandered to the ledger books, or how he never wanted to be seen walking arm in arm with her in the daylight. "You ready, Sophia?" asked Mrs. Gable, the town's gossipy postmistress, who had volunteered to fix Sophia's veil. The older woman's eyes darted over Sophia's dress, her mouth twitching in a poorly concealed smirk. "Well, you certainly took a lot of fabric, dear. Let's just hope the seams hold." Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a polite nod. "He loves me," she told herself firmly. "Jeb chose me." The organ wheezed to life, playing a clumsy rendition of the bridal chorus. The wooden doors opened, and Sophia began her long, agonizing walk down the aisle. The church was packed to the rafters. Bitter Creek rarely had a social event of this magnitude, and it felt as though every rancher, cowboy, and shopkeeper had crowded into the pews. As she walked, the whispers began. They were meant to be hushed, but the acoustics of the small timber church amplified every cruel syllable. "Look at her. She looks like a frosted barn. Jeb's a brave man, taking on a heifer like that. He's doing it for the store. Everyone knows it." Sophia's face burned a deep crimson, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She fixed her gaze on the altar, desperate to find comfort in Jeb's face. He stood there in his Sunday best, but there was no warmth in his eyes. His jaw was set tight, his arms crossed over his chest. Standing a few feet away from him in the front pew was Sarah Montgomery, a petite, blonde saloon girl known for her ruthless vanity. Sarah was staring at Jeb with a knowing, victorious smirk. Sophia finally reached the altar, her breathing shallow. Reverend O'Malley smiled kindly, opening his Bible. He went through the standard rites, his booming voice echoing off the rafters. Sophia felt a brief moment of peace. Soon, she would be a married woman. Soon, she would have a family. And the town's cruel voices would no longer matter. "And now," Reverend O'Malley announced, looking out at the congregation, "if anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now, or forever hold your peace." It was meant to be a formality, a brief second of silence before the final vows. But Jeb stepped back. He unclasped his hands and looked at Sophia with a mixture of disgust and dark amusement. "I object," Jeb said. His voice wasn't hesitant. It was loud, clear, and ringing with malicious pride. The church erupted into a collective gasp. Reverend O'Malley blinked, lowering his Bible. "Son, are you sure? This is a holy sacrament." "I'm sure," Jeb interrupted, turning his back on the reverend to face the congregation. He let out a cold, mocking laugh. "Did you people really think I was going to go through with this? Look at her." He thrust an accusing finger at Sophia. Sophia froze, her heart stopping in her chest. "Jeb, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. Please what, Sophia? He sneered, his handsome face twisting into something ugly. Did you honestly look in the mirror and think a man like me would want a woman like you? You're fat, Sophia. You're clumsy, you sweat like a workhorse, and you take up half the bed. The only thing attractive about you is the deed to that mercantile in your pocket. A horrifying sound rippled through the church. It started in the back row a snicker, followed by a giggle. Within seconds, it cascaded into full-blown laughter. The people of Bitter Creek, the neighbors Sophia had served flour and coffee to for years, were laughing at her. Sarah Montgomery stood up from the front pew, stepping forward to loop her arm through Jeb's. "You played her perfectly, darling," Sarah cooed loudly. "I told you I'd humiliate the sow in front of the whole county, didn't I?" Jeb boasted to Sarah, kissing her cheek. He looked back at Sophia, whose tears were now freely spilling down her flushed, rounded cheeks. "Leave the deed on the altar, Sophia. It's the least you can do for wasting my time." Sophia couldn't breathe. The walls of the church were spinning. The laughter of the townsfolk morphed into a deafening roar in her ears. The heavy satin of her dress felt like a cage. Dropping her bouquet, the delicate asters scattering across the wooden floorboards, she gathered up her skirts and turned. She didn't walk. She ran. She burst through the church doors, fleeing into the biting Wyoming wind, a broken bride in a town that had decided she was nothing but a joke. Sophia burst out onto the muddy thoroughfare of Bitter Creek, the cold wind whipping her veil into a tangled mess. She tripped on the boardwalk, landing hard on her knees in the freezing autumn mud. The pristine ivory satin soaked up the brown filth instantly, ruining the dress she had poured her heart into. She didn't care. She knelt there in the dirt, gasping for air, humiliated, abandoned, and entirely alone. Down the street, outside the very mercantile she owned, stood a man the entire territory knew only by reputation. His name was Silas Cross. The townsfolk called him the Beast of Wind River. He was a mountain man who lived deep in the treacherous, snow-capped peaks of the Wind River Range, descending into civilization only twice a year to trade pelts for powder, salt, and coffee. He was a towering, terrifying figure, standing an imposing 6'5", with shoulders as broad as a barn door. He wore heavy buckskins, a heavy buffalo hide coat, and a necklace of bear claws. Most frightening of all was his face, rugged and fiercely handsome, but marred by 3 jagged, pale scars that dragged down his left cheek from the claws of a grizzly he had fought with a hunting knife a decade prior. Silas was quietly lashing down a canvas tarp over his pack mule when the church doors burst open again. Jeb Ruskin strutted out onto the boardwalk, followed by Sarah and a dozen snickering townsfolk who hadn't gotten enough of the spectacle. Jeb, emboldened by the cruel adulation of the crowd, marched down the street toward where Sophia knelt, weeping in the mud. "I ain't done with you, Sophia," Jeb barked, his boots splashing in the muck. "I told you to leave that deed on the altar. Your daddy promised me this store, and I'm taking it." Sophia shrank back, shaking her head, pulling her ruined skirts around her. "No," she sobbed. "It's mine. You don't get my home, Jeb." Jeb lunged forward, grabbing Sophia roughly by the arm and yanking her upward. "Listen to me, you fat cow. You're going to hand over that paper right now, or I'll drag you back to that church by your hair and make you sign it over." The crowd stood by, watching. Some looked slightly uncomfortable, but no one, not the blacksmith, not the sheriff, not the reverend, stepped forward to help her. Sophia was a pariah, a woman deemed unworthy of protection simply because she didn't fit their shallow mold. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed through the street. It was the sound of a massive Sharps rifle butt striking the wooden boardwalk. "Let her go." The voice was like a physical blow, deep, gravelly, and vibrating with an unmistakable, lethal authority. Jeb froze. The snickering crowd instantly fell dead silent. They turned their heads toward the mercantile. Silas Cross stepped off the boardwalk, his heavy leather boots sinking into the mud. His silver-gray eyes were locked onto Jeb with the chilling intensity of a wolf stalking a crippled deer. He didn't rush. He simply walked toward them, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. "I said," Silas rumbled, stopping a few feet away, "take your hands off the lady." Jeb swallowed hard, his bravado faltering, but his pride pushed him to speak. "Now see here, Cross. This ain't none of your business, This is between me and my former fiancé." "She said no to the deed, boy," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" "Look at her," Jeb sneered, gesturing wildly to Sophia. "She's a massive beast. She's lucky I even gave her the time of day. I deserve that store for putting up with her." Before anyone could blink, Silas moved. Despite his immense size, he possessed the terrifying speed of a striking rattlesnake. His massive, calloused hand shot out, grabbing Jeb by the throat. He lifted the golden boy of Bitter Creek clean off his feet. Jeb gasped, his legs kicking frantically in the air as Silas hoisted him up with one arm. "You listen to me, you pathetic little worm," Silas growled, stepping so close that Jeb could smell the wood smoke and rawhide on him. "A man who disrespects a woman based on the softness of her flesh ain't a man at all. In the mountains, frail little porcelain dolls freeze to death. But a woman like her, with strength in her bones and fire in her spirit?" Silas threw a sidelong glance at Sophia, his cold eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. "She's the kind of woman a real man builds a dynasty with." With a flick of his wrist, Silas hurled Jeb backward. Jeb crashed into the muddy water trough, sputtering and choking, utterly humiliated. Sarah shrieked and backed away, hiding behind the crowd. Silas turned his back on the town and looked down at Sophia. She was trembling, looking up at the towering, scarred giant. She expected him to walk away, having done his good deed. Instead, Silas reached out his massive, scarred hand to her. "Stand up, Sophia Higgins," he said softly. Sophia hesitated, then placed her small, plump hand inside his. His grip was warm and solid. He pulled her effortlessly to her feet, ignoring the mud that smeared onto his buckskins. "You came out here today looking for a husband," Silas said, his deep voice carrying over the dead silent street, making sure every single person in Bitter Creek heard him. "You came looking for a man to share your life, to protect you, and to respect you." Sophia nodded slowly, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "I did, but they say I'm too big, that nobody would ever want me." Silas reached out, his rough thumb gently wiping the tear from her cheek. The intimacy of the gesture from such a terrifying man made the crowd gasp. "They are fools," Silas declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I've spent 5 winters alone in that cabin, building a homestead, clearing land, making a kingdom out of the wilderness. I need a queen, Sophia, not a fragile twig who will snap at the first frost. I need a woman with substance, a woman with a warm heart and strong hands." He stepped closer, towering over her, yet Sophia felt no fear, only an overwhelming, shocking sense of safety. "Marry me, Sophia," the Beast of Wind River said, his eyes burning with fierce sincerity. "Sign the deed of this store over to that spineless boy if he wants it so badly. Leave this miserable town. Come with me to the mountains. I vow on my life you will never shed another tear over a man's cruelty. I will treat you like the goddess you are." The silence that fell over Bitter Creek was absolute. Jeb, pulling himself out of the trough, stared in open-mouthed shock. Mrs. Gable looked as though she might faint. The town's outcast, the plus-size bride they had all gathered to mock, had just been claimed by the most dangerous, wealthiest trapper in the territory. Sophia looked at the muddy town that had always despised her. She looked at Jeb, pathetic and soaked. Then she looked up into the rugged, scarred face of Silas Cross. For the first time in her life, a man was looking at her curves not with disgust, but with fierce, unapologetic hunger and respect. A spark of defiance ignited in Sophia's chest. She lifted her chin, her mud-stained satin dress suddenly feeling like a royal gown. "Reverend O'Malley!" Sophia shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to break the silence. The frightened Reverend stepped forward from the boardwalk. "Yes, Sophia?" Sophia tightened her grip on Silas's massive hand, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her lips. "Dust off your Bible, Reverend," she said. "There's going to be a wedding today, after all." The wedding of Sophia Higgins and Silas Cross was the shortest, most shocking ceremony in the history of the Wyoming Territory. Reverend O'Malley's voice shook as he rushed through the vows, his eyes darting nervously toward the towering, scarred mountain man who stood protectively over the bride. Sophia, still shivering in her mud-stained satin, spoke her vows with a newfound, ringing clarity. When Silas placed a heavy, solid gold band, a family heirloom, he carried on a leather cord around his neck, onto her plump finger. The warmth of the metal seemed to spread straight to her battered heart. Within the hour, they rode out of Bitter Creek. Sophia sat wrapped in thick grizzly furs atop Silas's massive draft horse, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. She didn't look back at the mercantile, nor did she look at Jeb Ruskin, who stood on the boardwalk, fuming and thoroughly humiliated. The journey into the Wind River Range took 3 grueling days. As they ascended into the jagged, snow-draped peaks, Sophia braced herself for a life of miserable squalor. She had always heard that mountain men lived in drafty, dirt-floored shacks, surviving on hardtack and squirrel meat. She could not have been more wrong. When they finally broke through a dense pine thicket into a secluded, high-altitude valley, Sophia gasped. Nestled against the side of a glittering, frozen lake stood a sprawling log manor. It was a masterpiece of pioneer engineering, built from massive, hand-hewn cedar logs. Stone chimneys puffed fragrant wood smoke into the crisp winter air. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cross," Silas murmured, lifting her down from the saddle with effortless strength. Inside, the cabin was a revelation. It was warm and glowing with the light of oil lamps. Thick Persian rugs traded from traveling merchants in San Francisco covered the polished hardwood floors. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with literature, philosophy, and history. Silas, it turned out, was not a savage beast. He was a highly educated man who had chosen the solitude of the mountains over the corruption of eastern cities. He had amassed a quiet fortune dominating the western fur trade, and his home was a fortress of luxury hidden in the wilderness. In the weeks that followed, Sophia underwent a transformation. The toxic voices of Bitter Creek faded, replaced by the howling wind and Silas's deep, steady reassurances. He worshipped the very ground she walked on. When she cooked, he praised her skill. When she helped him chop firewood, her broad shoulders handling the heavy axe with surprising ease, he looked at her with blatant, burning admiration. And at night, beneath the heavy quilts, Silas banished the last of her insecurities. He traced the soft curves of her waist and the fullness of her thighs with rough, reverent hands. "They called you a flaw," he whispered one night, kissing the scars where her corset had once dug into her flesh. "But God made you a masterpiece. You are warmth. You are life." For the first time, Sophia felt truly beautiful, desired not for what she owned, but for the magnificent, substantial woman she was. Meanwhile, 70 miles below in Bitter Creek, a very different reality was unfolding. Jeb Ruskin had taken over the Higgins General Store, strutting around like the king of the county. But his reign was short-lived. Jeb was arrogant, lazy, and terrible with numbers. Within 2 months, he had alienated the major ranchers by insulting their wives and had failed to order sufficient winter supplies. The store's shelves sat empty. To make matters worse, Sarah Montgomery left him for a traveling gambler when Jeb's pockets ran dry. Desperate to save himself from ruin, Jeb began tearing the store apart, looking for Thomas Higgins' legendary hidden safe. Late one evening, he pried up a loose floorboard beneath the counter and found a heavy iron lockbox. Inside wasn't money, but a stack of legal documents that made Jeb's blood run cold. The mercantile was just a front. Thomas Higgins had secretly purchased the mineral rights to the entirety of Bitter Creek and the surrounding 20 miles. The geological surveys attached to the deeds confirmed a massive, untapped vein of high-grade anthracite coal sitting right beneath the town. The land was worth millions, but there was a catch. The documents clearly stated that the mineral rights were bound to a separate trust, one that required Sophia's direct signature to transfer or sell. Jeb hadn't claimed Sophia's true fortune. He had only claimed an empty building. If the newly formed Union Pacific Railroad executives, who were already scouting the area, found out, Sophia would become the richest woman in Wyoming, and Jeb would be left with nothing but a bankrupt, failing store. A dark, greedy desperation settled over Jeb. He wasn't about to lose millions to a woman he had publicly discarded. He needed her signature, and he didn't care how he got it. The dead of winter had descended upon the mountains. The snow was waist deep, transforming the valley into an isolated, silent kingdom. Silas had left before dawn to check his eastern trapline, promising to be back by nightfall. Sophia was humming softly in the kitchen, pulling a freshly baked loaf of sourdough from the cast-iron stove. She wore a simple, loose-fitting woolen dress that accentuated her curves, her cheeks flushed with the heat of the fire and the vitality of her new life. The peace was shattered by the violent crack of splintering wood. The heavy oak front door kicked inward, slamming against the wall. Sophia dropped the bread pan, whirling around. Standing in the doorway, wrapped in stolen pelts and shivering violently from the cold, was Jeb Ruskin. Flanking him were two notorious hired guns from the Badlands, Barton and Cole, their faces red with frostbite, revolvers drawn and leveled directly at Sophia. "Hello, Sophia," Jeb sneered, stepping into the warmth of the cabin. His eyes darted around, taking in the wealth and luxury of the room with a flash of jealous rage. "Looks like the beast keeps you well fed." Sophia didn't scream. The trembling, frightened girl who had wept in the mud outside the church was gone. In her place stood the Queen of Wind River. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. "You have 5 seconds to get out of my home, Jeb," Sophia said, her voice eerily calm, channeling the lethal quiet she had learned from Silas. Jeb laughed, pulling the stack of legal documents from his coat. "Not until you sign these. Did you know your daddy was sitting on a coal empire? Millions, Sophia. Millions of dollars right beneath that miserable town. Sign these over to me, and maybe my boys here won't burn this fancy little cabin to the ground." "I wouldn't sign over a pile of horse manure to you," Sophia spat. Barton, the larger of the two thugs, stepped forward, cocking his revolver. "Don't get smart, fatty. Just sign the paper, or I'll put a bullet in your kneecap and make you write in blood." Sophia's gaze flicked to the mantelpiece. Silas's loaded Winchester rifle was leaning against the stone, just 3 feet away. "I said," Jeb barked, slamming the papers onto the dining table and drawing his own pistol, "sign it!" Sophia moved. She didn't have the frail, fainting constitution of the women Jeb was used to. With a surge of explosive, grounded power, she grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and hurled it directly at Barton's head. The cast iron struck the thug squarely in the jaw with a sickening crack, sending him crashing into the bookshelf, unconscious before he hit the rug. In the fraction of a second that Cole and Jeb flinched, Sophia dove for the mantelpiece. She rolled her sturdy frame, absorbing the impact, and came up with the Winchester nestled perfectly in her shoulder. She racked the lever, the sharp clack-clack echoing like thunder in the room. She pointed the barrel dead at Jeb's chest. "Drop it," Sophia commanded. Cole, enraged, raised his pistol toward her. "You miserable." Before Cole could pull the trigger, a shadow blotted out the sunlight in the doorway. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. A massive, gloved hand reached through the doorway, gripping Cole by the back of his collar. The thug was hoisted backward into the snow with a yelp of terror. Silas Cross stepped into his home. He looked at the kicked-in door, the unconscious man on his floor, and the pistol trembling in Jeb's hand. The scars on Silas's face were stark white against his flushed skin. His silver eyes burned with a murderous, unholy fury. "You brought guns into my house," Silas whispered. The sound was worse than a shout. It was the low growl of an apex predator about to strike. "You aimed them at my wife." Jeb dropped his gun as if it were red hot. His knees gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, sobbing in pure terror. "Cross, wait, please. It was just business. I just needed a signature." Silas didn't bother speaking. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed Jeb by the front of his coat, and hurled him straight through the front window. Glass shattered outward in a spectacular explosion as Jeb landed violently in a deep snowbank outside. Silas walked out onto the porch, drawing his heavy hunting knife. Cole was already scrambling down the mountain, abandoning his horse in his haste to escape the beast. Jeb tried to crawl away, his face bleeding from the glass, but Silas planted a heavy boot on the coward's back, pinning him to the frozen earth. Sophia stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester still in her hands, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She walked down the steps and stood over Jeb. "Sophia, please!" Jeb begged, spitting snow and blood. I'm sorry. I'll leave. Just don't let him kill me. Sophia looked down at the man who had humiliated her, who had laughed at her body, who had tried to steal her dignity. She felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sadness, just pity. She pulled the legal documents from her apron pocket, having snatched them from the table. She looked at the deeds, the proof of a vast fortune. You thought my size made me weak, Jeb, Sophia said softly. You thought because I didn't fit into a corset, I didn't deserve respect, but you were the weak one all along. She tore the documents in half, then into quarters. She let the pieces fall, fluttering like snowflakes onto Jeb's trembling back. I don't need your town, and I certainly don't need your store, Sophia said. But know this, my lawyers in Cheyenne will be taking back the mercantile tomorrow. You are bankrupt. You are nothing. She turned to Silas, her eyes softening as she looked at her husband. Let him go, my love. He isn't worth dirtying your blade. Silas stared down at Jeb for a long, terrifying moment. Finally, he lifted his boot. Run, boy, Silas rumbled. And if you ever step foot in the Wind River Range again, I'll leave your bones for the wolves. Jeb scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't look back, disappearing into the blinding white snow, a broken, penniless exile who would never be welcomed in Wyoming again. Silas sheathed his knife and turned to Sophia. He looked at the shattered window, the unconscious thug inside, and the Winchester still held firmly in his wife's capable hands. A slow, deeply proud smile spread across his scarred face. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing at all. Sophia laughed, dropping the rifle into the snow as she threw her arms around his thick neck. Did I do well, husband? She teased, her heart soaring. You were magnificent, Silas growled, capturing her lips in a fierce, passionate kiss that melted the winter chill. My beautiful, fierce queen. They had faced the cruelty of the world and conquered it. Together, in the heart of the wild frontier, the beast and his plus-sized bride built a legendary dynasty of love, wealth, and unyielding respect, proving to the world that true worth is never measured by the size of a waist, but by the undeniable strength of a woman's spirit. What a thrilling journey of heartbreak, vengeance, and true love. Sophia went from a humiliated bride to the undisputed queen of the mountains, proving that true beauty and strength come from within. Silas saw the diamond the town discarded and built a legendary legacy with her. If you loved this Wild West romance and want more incredible stories of justice and passion, be sure to hit that like button, share this tale with your friends, and subscribe to our video channel for more.